Hi everyone, Troy Martin, TMFitness, and welcome to Whiteboard Wafflings. So I'm going to talk about functional movement today and looking at functional movement from a joint by joint perspective. This is a concept that was devised by Mike Boyle and Gray Cook of the functional movement screen. So I need to give credit there where it's due, because a lot of people talk about this joint by joint approach without really mentioning the people who kind of created it or at least popularised it. So what do we mean by joint by joint? There's a series of joints throughout the body. Some of those joints have to be mobile, some of them have to be stable. If the mobile joints lack mobility for any reason, the stable joints tend to compensate for that by mobilising more than they should, and then that causes problems. Starting at the bottom and working our way up, the ankles are a mobile joint. They have to work through the sagittal plane mainly. Yes, they can rotate, but they're mainly a sagittal joint. So you have to get dorsal and plantar flexion of the foot. Moving up from there, the knee needs to be stable. Again, yes, it's a joint, it moves, but it needs to be stable. You don't want excessive movement through the knees. The hips are a mobile joint. The lumbar spine or lower back is a stable joint. The thoracic spine or mid-spine is a mobile joint. And then in the shoulder, you have the gleno-humeral joint, which is the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. That should be stable. Even though it's a rotational synovial joint, it needs to be stable. And then the scapula, the shoulder blade, needs to be mobile. So again, working from a way up. So if there's dysfunction in one of the mobile joints, the joint above or below will usually be affected adversely. So if the ankle is stiff, and I find this a lot, I examine a lot of bodies, I do a lot of movement screening, and there's a whole kind of assessment process involved in the body geometry fit system as well. I look at feet a lot. If people's range of motion of the foot, if the foot is very flat, overpronated, and if in particular if they lack a full range of dorsiflexion, so bringing the toes up towards the shin, if there's a lack of full range of motion through the ankle, that moves up to the knee. So the knee has to compensate for that lack of movement in the ankle. So if you're experiencing knee issues, particularly if you're a runner, is every likelihood that your ankles are stiff. Moving up then to the hips. Now the hips are a complicated one because they're a multi-plane joint. They flex, they extend, there's rotation. It needs to be stable ranges of motion. So for instance, if the hip flexors are weak, if they're struggling to flex the hip, then something's got to compensate, and that something is usually in the lower back. You will tuck the pelvis under. You'll go into a posterior tilt to create flexion of the hip. So that will affect the muscles around the lower back, the QL in particular, or quadratus lumborum, which attaches to the same portion of the spine as the psoas, which is one of the hip flexor muscles. That can become very tonic and sore. So if you get that pain in the lower back just above your hip on one side, that could be your QL that's causing that, and it may be that your hip flexors are dysfunctional. Likewise, if the glutes aren't firing, then to extend the hip, so bringing the leg back, you will then tilt the pelvis into an anterior tilt and hyperextend the lower spine to achieve flexion of the extension of the hip rather than using the glutes. So if the hips, if they're not mobile with a stable range of motion, so if they lack strength through their range of motion and they're not moving correctly or optimally as a result of that, the lower back usually cops it. So if you've got pain in the lower back, you probably need to be looking at hips. Don't keep massaging the lower back, strengthen your hips. This also transfers down to the knee as well. In my experience, knee issues, yes, they can well be related to a lack of range of motion through the ankle, but there's a lack of stability at the hip, and the knees copying it, particularly with runners. So for knees, I find you often have to look at the hips and the ankles. And then the lumbar spine, the lumbar spine has to be stable, as we've mentioned. If the thoracic spine doesn't have the full ranges of motion that it should have, and this is a really common thing as well, I find a lot of people, due to poor posture, sedentary living, or excessive anterior chain and sagittal plane exercise and movements, if the thoracic spine doesn't contain its full range of rotation, flexion and extension, then that often transfers up into the neck and shoulders. So if you're getting neck and shoulder issues, it could well be that you're stiff through the thoracic spine. But then again, because it can transfer up or down, I also find that a stiff thoracic spine leads to hypermobility through the lumbar spine. So if you can't rotate the thoracic spine, so that's your rib cage rotating, you will rotate through the lumbar spine, and then you're putting this torque, this shearing force through the lumbar. And the amount of people that I encounter that have had disc dysfunction identified in the L4, L5, so that's the lumbar discs, L4 and L5, and even the sacroiliac or SI joint in the lower back. Yes, that's probably related to a hip dysfunction, but it's probably also due to immobility through the thoracic spine. So working on thoracic mobility is really, really important. It's always a big area that I work on with my clients. And then looking at the shoulder as well. So the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint, is a synovial joint. It rotates and it extends and it flexes and it adducts and it abducts, but it has to be stable. So it has to be able to create that range of motion, but in a stable manner. If you're doing pressing exercises, push-ups and bench press, for example, the glenohumeral joint needs to stabilise through that range of motion, and if it's not doing that, you will create compensations. And that's why people so often, and I've seen this, like big guys in the gym that have got scars here, but they've blown out their rotator cuff because they're doing loads of massive bench pressing and they're not stabilising the shoulders correctly. The scapula, the shoulder blade, is the mobile joint in the shoulder. So the shoulder blade, it rotates, it elevates, it depresses, it retracts, it protracts. It needs to be rotating upwards when you bring the arm up. If the shoulder blade isn't rotating through that range of motion, you'll create compensation through the shoulder joint itself, through the glenohumeral joint, and then other muscles are compensating, and that's when you get your issues with your rotator cuff and so on. So understanding how the body works and how these joints work can revolutionise the way you program your exercising and the way you approach pain issues. If you have chronic pain issues, I'm not talking acute pain where you've pulled a muscle, I'm talking chronic pain, like, you know, let's talk about lower back pain. So you go to the doctor, I've got lower back pain, it aches all the time, it hurts, every time I bend over to pick a spoon up off the floor, I get shooting pains through my back, whatever. The doctor will tell you to take painkillers and get some bed rest. They won't tell you why your back hurts, and they won't tell you how to stop the back from hurting, and they won't tell you how to prevent it from happening again in the future. That's not to say that, you know, GPs and doctors don't know what they're talking about. They do, but they're not back pain experts. You need to see a specialist in that area to A, diagnose the back pain, and then B, treat the back pain. If you come out of the doctor's surgery, out of the GP's office, and you haven't been given a strategy for dealing with, coping and improving your back pain, you haven't seen a back pain specialist, and you need a second opinion. But with chronic pain, so that's pain that's been around for a long time and there's no discernible, definable moment that you can nail that down to. So it's not like an impact injury, for instance. It's just something that's developed through movement compensation because your hips aren't working, or because your mid-spine is immobile, or both. So to address the lower back pain, you need to create stability through the lumbar by strengthening your core. You need to mobilize the hips by strengthening the muscles through their full ranges of motion, and you need to mobilize the thoracic spine with three-dimensional movements, rotation and extension in particular. So that's just one example. So as I say, knowing about these joints and about how that impacts you on a functional basis, and when I say functional, I'm talking about daily living. It can revolutionise the way you program your training. It can revolutionise the way you just move on a daily basis. Okay guys, so I hope that was useful for you. As always, if you've got any comments, put them in the box below. Share this, tell your friends, tell everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Later.